My brother laughed when he found out he inherited the farm, and I only got an old mill, but soon he was begging me to give him a job. So there I was, standing in the stuffy lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and gas station coffee. You know the kind, bitter enough to wake the dead, but weak enough to disappoint your soul. My hands were still caked with dirt from the farm. I'd been working since I could barely reach a shovel handle. 3 generations of sweat and dreams had lived in that soil, and I was absolutely certain it was all mine. Boy, was I wrong. The lawyer, some guy in a cheap suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat and started reading Dad's will. I was sitting there thinking about all those mornings I'd woken up at 4 a.m. to feed the cattle. All those summers I'd spent fixing fences instead of hanging out with friends. Meanwhile, Kevin, my stepbrother, was sitting across from me in his fancy city suit, checking his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. Then came the bombshell. Everything, the farm, the house, the good land, even Dad's prize John Deere, all of it went to Kevin. Kevin, who hadn't touched a pitchfork in 20 years. Kevin, who had called farming playing in the dirt for poor people. Kevin, whose biggest contribution to agriculture was knowing which aisle the organic kale was in at Whole Foods. And what did I get? An old grist mill by Blue Creek that hadn't turned since the Carter administration, and a beat-up trailer where the mice had apparently been throwing raves for the past decade. I could literally hear them partying when I walked in there later that day. Kevin looked at me with this smirk that made me want to introduce his face to my fist. He said something about how my mill was like an old pickup truck. Looked nice in photos, but wouldn't get you anywhere. Real charming guy, my stepbrother. The worst part wasn't even Kevin's attitude. It was knowing my stepmother Sandra had been whispering poison in Dad's ear for years. She'd always looked at me like I was something she'd scrape off her designer boots. Every family dinner, every holiday, she'd made these little comments about how I was living in the past and needed to find a real job. Dad would just grunt and change the subject, but I could see her words had been eating away at him like rust on metal. After the lawyer finished his legal mumbo-jumbo, I drove out to mill in my actual old pickup, a '92 Ford that had more character than Kevin's entire personality. The mill sat there by Blue Creek, like a forgotten monument to better times. Paint peeling, roof sagging, weeds growing to the foundation stones. It looked about as hopeful as I felt. But here's the thing about old buildings. They hold memories like a jar holds lightning bugs. As soon as I stepped inside, I was 8 years old again, standing next to Grandpa as the great wooden wheel churned through the creek water. The smell of wet wood and grain dust. The rhythmic groaning of ancient machinery. Grandpa's voice explaining how water power had built America one grain of wheat at a time. He used to call the mill our castle, our spaceship to anywhere we wanted to go. While other kids were playing video games, Grandpa and I would pretend we were knights defending our fortress or astronauts powering our rocket with creek water. Those had been the days when anything seemed possible, when an old mill felt like the center of the universe. The trailer behind the mill was a different story entirely. If the mill was a faded dream, the trailer was a straight-up nightmare. Holes in the walls, furniture that belonged in a museum of bad taste, and a family of mice who'd apparently decided to start their own civilization in the kitchen cabinets. I'm talking mouse highways, mouse condos, the whole 9 yards. They'd basically turned my inheritance into their personal Disney World. But as I stood there feeling sorry for myself, something caught my eye. In the corner, hidden under a moldy tarp, was Grandpa's old wooden chest. My heart started beating faster as I pried it open, and that's when I found a real treasure. Inside were yellow blueprints, hand-drawn with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of working with your hands. At the top, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, 1947, for Jake, the river will give light and flower. Below that were detailed drawings of a hydroelectric turbine, something way ahead of its time. Grandpa had been planning to turn our little mill into a power station decades before anyone was talking about renewable energy. I sat there holding those papers like they were made of gold, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Grandpa had always been a dreamer, but this was different. This was engineering real plans for something that could actually work. For the first time since hearing that, Will, I felt something other than anger and disappointment. Of course, that's when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the grimy trailer window, I saw Sandra's spotless white SUV parked by the mill. She'd probably driven over to gloat about how Kevin was already making plans to sell the farm to some development company. A minute later, she appeared in the trailer doorway, took one look at me sitting in that disaster with those old papers in my hands, and let out this laugh that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. She told me to sell the mill for scrap, wood, and move on with my life. Said I'd never amount to anything trying to fix up a relic that should have been torn down decades ago. Her words hit like a slap, but instead of breaking me down, they lit something up inside me. Pure, stubborn anger mixed with determination. The kind of cocktail that made people do crazy things like restore century-old mills. That's when I remembered something Grandpa used to say when we watched the creek water flow past a mill wheel. He'd point to Blue Creek and tell me it was like an engine. All that power just waiting for someone smart enough to find the right key to start up. Grandpa had a way with words that stuck with you long after he was gone. He used to say life was like a mill wheel. It wouldn't turn unless you gave it a push. Simple wisdom from a simple man who understood that nothing good happened by accident. As Sandra drove away in her spotless SUV, probably already planning how to spend Kevin's farm money on another kitchen renovation, I went back into the trailer and opened that chest again. There, tucked under the blueprints, was something that made my throat tight and my eyes burn. A faded photograph of me at 5 years old, covered head to toe in flour, laughing my head off while Grandpa grinned beside me at the mill. We both looked so happy, so sure that the world was full of possibilities. On the back, in his shaky handwriting, were 8 words that would change everything. Jake, if the world knocks you down, the mill will save you. I held that picture and felt something shift inside me, like a rusty gear finally finding its groove. Maybe Kevin had gotten the farm, maybe Sandra had gotten her way, and maybe I had gotten stuck with a pile of rotting wood and a mouse hotel. But I had also gotten something they couldn't touch, Grandpa's faith in me, and a crazy dream that just might work. The sun was setting over Blue Creek, painting the water gold, and making the old mill wheel look almost magical in the fading light. I thought about that 8-year-old kid in the photo, covered in flour and believing anything was possible. Maybe it was time to find out if that kid had been right. Sitting there in that broken-down trailer, holding a 20-year-old photo and some hand-drawn blueprints, I made a decision that would either save my life or drive me completely insane. Maybe both. But as Grandpa always said, the wheel wouldn't turn unless you gave it a push. And brother, I was ready to push. 2 days after holding that photo and making my crazy decision, I found myself sitting at the Rusty Spur, the kind of dive bar where the beer was cold, the bacon was greasy, and the country music was loud enough to drown out your problems. The smell of fried food and stale cigarettes hung in the air like a comfortable blanket, while some guy on the jukebox was singing about lost pickup trucks and broken hearts. Basically the soundtrack to every rural American's life. I was nursing my second Budweiser and trying to forget about Kevin's smug face when someone smacked me on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock me off my bar stool. I spun around, ready to start some trouble, and there stood Anna Martinez, my old high school buddy, who I hadn't seen in 10 years. Anna had always been the smartest kid in our graduating class of 43, the one who'd gotten a full ride to engineering school, while the rest of us were figuring out which trade to learn or which farm to work. She looked exactly the same but different. Still had those sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, but now she wore them with the confidence of someone who'd conquered the world outside our little town. She took one look at me slumped over my beer, like a kicked dog, and burst out laughing. The kind of laugh that was equal parts sympathy and amusement. She said I looked like someone had stolen my last bit of hope, and was probably selling it on eBay. Classic Anna, always ready with a joke to cut through the tension. Anna had moved back to town temporarily to help her dad, Frank, who was having some health issues. When I told her about Dad's Kevin getting the farm, and me being stuck with the old mill, she got this look in her eyes that I remember from high school physics class. The look that meant she was solving a problem nobody else had even noticed yet. When I mentioned Grandpa's blueprints, her engineer brain lit up like a Christmas tree. She practically dragged me out of the bar, insisting we had to go get her dad and show him everything. We swung by her place to pick up Frank, who was sitting on the porch tinkering with an old radio. Frank Martinez was a Vietnam vet who could fix anything with an engine, a gear, or moving parts. The guy had hands that spoke fluent machine. Get him a broken lawn mower, and he'd have it purring like a kitten in 20 minutes. He moved slower than he used to, but was still sharp as a tack when it came to mechanical stuff. Standing in that moldy trailer, watching Frank examine Grandpa's blueprints with the intensity of detectives studying evidence, I felt something I hadn't felt since reading Dad's Will Hope. Frank traced the lines with his finger, muttering technical terms that sounded like a foreign language to me. Finally, Frank looked up and said something that nearly knocked me over. He said my grandfather would have made Edison jealous if he'd actually built this turbine. The design was simple but brilliant, using the natural flow of Blue Creek to generate electricity while still powering the millstones. Grandpa had been thinking about sustainable energy before it was even a thing. Anna was practically bouncing with excitement, talking about micro-hydroelectric systems and renewable energy credits. I felt like a caveman trying to understand rocket science, but her enthusiasm was infectious. She said we could restore the mill, get it running, and maybe even make some serious money. That's when reality hit me, like a cold shower. I reminded Anna that I was a farmer, not a businessman. I knew how to grow corn and fix tractors, not navigate bureaucratic red tape and fancy engineering projects. Anna just laughed and said farmers were businessmen. They just told better stories and had dirtier boots. She started talking about historical preservation grants, tax incentives, and something called net metering that would let us sell excess electricity back to the power company. My head was spinning. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe Kevin hadn't gotten everything after all. The first step was getting the mill registered as a historical landmark. Anna knew someone who knew someone at the State Preservation Office, and within a week we had an inspector coming out to evaluate the property. The inspector, a nervous little guy who looked like he'd never seen a working farm, pronounced our mill architecturally significant and representative of early American industrial heritage. Getting approved for historic status meant we could apply for restoration grants, but it also meant we had to follow strict guidelines about how we fix things up. Everything had to be period appropriate and historically accurate. I joked that if we were going for complete historical accuracy, maybe we should leave the mice in the trailer since they'd probably been there longer than I had. The real challenge was getting financing for the project. Banks aren't exactly lining up to loan money for century-old mill restorations, especially the guys whose biggest asset was a broken-down pickup truck. My credit score was about as impressive as a soggy pretzel, thanks to some bad decisions I made trying to keep the farm afloat before Dad passed. That's where Anna's engineering degree and natural charm came in handy. She put together a presentation that would have made NASA proud, complete with charts, graphs, and projections showing how our micro-hydroelectric system could pay for itself within 5 years. She even wore a business suit. I'd never seen Anna in anything fancier than jeans and work boots. The bank meeting was like something out of a comedy movie. There I was in my cleanest flannel shirt, sitting next to Anna, who was throwing around terms like kilowatt capacity and grid interconnection protocols, while some banker in a tie tried to keep up. Frank sat in the corner, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, occasionally nodding when Anna mentioned something technical. For a while, it looked like we were going to get turned down flat. The banker kept talking about risk assessment and collateral requirements, basically fancy ways of saying I was too poor and too risky to trust with 50 grand. But Anna kept pushing, explaining how microhydro was the future and how our mill could be a model for rural sustainable development. Finally, Anna played her ace card. She mentioned that the local news had been doing stories about green energy initiatives and how a successful mill restoration could bring positive attention to the bank's community involvement. Nothing motivates a small-town banker like the possibility of good publicity. We walked out of that bank with a $50,000 loan, and my head still spinning. Anna was grinning like she just won the lottery, while I felt like I just signed my life away. Frank patted me on the back and said something about how the wheel wouldn't turn unless you greased it with sweat. Pretty much summed up what we were getting ourselves into. The actual restoration work was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle while riding a mechanical bull during an earthquake. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, usually twice. The creek's dam structure that controlled water flow to the mill had developed serious cracks over the decades, so we had to rebuild it using techniques that were both historically accurate and structurally sound. I went through 2 welding machines trying to repair the metal framework that supported the wheel. Frank kept muttering about how they didn't make steel like they used to, while Anna documented everything with her camera for the Historical Society. She joked that we weren't restoring a mill, we were creating our own reality show about 3 people slowly losing their minds. The worst part was dealing with all the permits and inspections, environmental impact studies, electrical safety inspections, historical preservation reviews. I needed permits to get permits. Anna handled most of the paperwork because she actually understood what half of it meant, while I focused on the parts of the job that involved hammers and common sense. Frank turned out to be worth his weight in gold when it came to the mechanical restoration. He could look at a gear that had been rusted solid for 40 years and somehow coax it back to life. His hands might have been shaking a little more than they used to, but his brain still worked like a precision instrument when it came to figuring out how things were supposed to fit together. There were days when I seriously questioned my sanity. Standing knee-deep in creek water, trying to position massive stones while Anna shouted measurement from the bank and Frank criticized my technique. I wondered if Kevin had been right about the mill being worthless. But then I'd remember Grandpa's photo and that message on the back, and I'd keep going. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday in November. We'd been working for 3 months, and the mill was finally assembled and ready for testing. Frank had rigged up a temporary electrical connection, and Anna had calibrated the turbine alignment about 6 times. I stood there watching 40 years of rust and neglect wash away as clear creek water started flowing through the system again. The wheel began to turn slowly, creaking and groaning like an old man getting out of bed. Water cascaded through the buckets, each one catching and releasing with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. Frank was monitoring gauges and muttering numbers, while Anna checked connections and made notes in her ever-present notebook. Then something magical happened. The ancient millstones, which hadn't moved since Carter was president, began to turn. The sound was incredible, a deep, rumbling hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice mixed in with that sound, telling me stories about how water power had built America 1 grain at a time. But the real surprise came when I walked around the back of the mill to check something Frank had mentioned. There, carved into the wooden beam near the main shaft, was something I'd never noticed before. Jake and Grandpa, 1991. Keep the wheel turning. My throat got tight and my eyes started burning as I realized Grandpa had left me one final message, hidden in plain sight all these years. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the wheel turn and feeling like Grandpa was standing right beside me. Anna and Frank were celebrating a successful test run, but I was having my own private moment with a memory that was 20 years old but felt like yesterday. That's when I whispered something to the empty air that probably sounded crazy to anyone who might have heard it. I promised Grandpa I wouldn't let him down. The wheel was turning again, just like he'd always said it would. And for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The wheel was humming like a contented cat. Flour was dusting everything in sight, and I stood there feeling like some kind of cowboy who just tamed a wild bronco. Word spread through town faster than gossip at a church potluck, and suddenly Blue Creek Mill had more visitors than a roadside fireworks stand on the 4th of July. Anna looked at the crowd of curious locals wandering around our property and got that entrepreneurial gleam in her eye that I was starting to recognize. She said this wasn't just a mill anymore. This was a story we could sell to America. I thought she was getting a little ahead of herself, but Anna had been right about everything else so far. Frank was in his element, explaining the mechanical workings to anyone who'd listen. Watching him demonstrate how the water flow controlled the millstone speed, you never guessed this was the same guy who'd been struggling with his health just months before. Having a purpose had given him new life, and seeing kids' faces light up when the ancient stones started grinding corn made all our hard work feel worthwhile. That's when Anna dropped her next bombshell. She wanted to create a brand around the mill, something that would capture both the historical significance and the modern sustainability angle. We spent an evening in the trailer, which was now actually livable thanks to some serious mouse eviction and basic repairs, brainstorming names and concepts. We settled on River Mill Flour and Light since 1907. Anna said it perfectly captured what we were doing, honoring the past while powering the future. She designed a logo featuring the mill wheel with wheat stalks and lightning bolts, and I had to admit it looked pretty professional for something created on her laptop while sitting at my wobbly kitchen table. The real game changer came when Anna decided to embrace social media. Now, I'm about as tech-savvy as a brick, but Anna understood that stories spread differently in the modern world. She set up accounts on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, determined to show people that sustainable living didn't have to mean giving up convenience or tradition. The first video she made nearly killed me from embarrassment. There I was in my favorite flannel shirt, explaining how we'd restored a century-old mill to generate clean electricity while producing heritage flour. The wheel was turning behind me. The millstones were humming their ancient song, and Anna somehow made it all look cinematic with her phone camera. I felt like a complete fool talking to that little device, but Anna kept encouraging me to just tell the story naturally. She said people didn't want polished corporate messaging. They wanted authentic stories from real people doing interesting things. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one who looked like a scarecrow trying to explain quantum physics. The video went live on a Tuesday evening, and by Wednesday morning it had 10,000 views. By Thursday, we were at 50,000. By the weekend, over 100,000 people had watched my awkward attempt at social media stardom. Anna was practically dancing around the mill, showing me comments from people all over the country who were inspired by our story. Suddenly, everyone wanted our flour. The artisanal baking crowd had discovered us, and apparently stone-ground flour from a working water mill was like gold to these folks. Anna set up an online ordering system, and we started shipping 5-pound bags of our heritage wheat flour to customers from California to Maine. The turbine was performing better than Grandpa's wildest dreams. We were generating about 15 kilowatts of electricity, more than enough to power the mill operation, with surplus flowing back into grid through net metering. Our electric bill had gone from expensive to profitable, and the power company was actually paying us for the clean energy we were producing. Local bakeries started seeking us out, wanting to use our flour for specialty breads and pastries. There's something about stone-ground flour that industrial mills just can't replicate. It retains more of the wheat's natural oils and flavors. The head baker at Sunset Cafe told me our flour made bread that tasted like her grandmother's recipes, back when baking was more art than science. The county fair that summer became our unofficial coming-out party. We set up a booth with bags of flour, pamphlets about sustainable energy, and photos documenting the mill's restoration. Frank brought some of his old tools and demonstrated traditional millwright techniques, while Anna handled the business side and social media documentation. Kids were fascinated by the whole operation. They'd never seen anything like it, a building that made both food and electricity using nothing but flowing water. Parents kept taking pictures of their children standing next to the great wheel, and I started thinking this wasn't just about preserving history anymore. We were creating new memories for a whole generation. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, asked me if the mill was magic. I told her it wasn't magic exactly, but it was pretty close. It was ingenuity and hard work wrapped up in old wood and flowing water. Her mom bought 3 bags of flour and said she was going to teach her daughter to bake bread the old-fashioned way. That's when it hit me that we weren't just running a mill. We were keeping alive something that connected people to their food, their history, and their environment in ways that modern life had made them forget. Anna had been right when she said the mill wasn't about flour. It was about how the seeds of the past could grow into something meaningful for the future. The success brought its own challenges. We were selling more flour than we could produce with our current setup, and the demand for tours was starting to interfere with actual production. Anna suggested we needed to expand our operation, maybe add another millstone or upgrade our electrical generation capacity. The financial picture was looking better than I dared hope. Between flour sales, electricity revenue, and the occasional tour groups that left donations, we were not only covering our loan payments, but actually turning a profit. Anna kept detailed spreadsheets showing our income streams, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt financially secure. That's when the media attention really started rolling in. A freelance journalist who'd seen our TikTok videos contacted us about writing a feature story for Regional Living magazine. She spent a whole day at the mill, interviewing all three of us and taking professional photographs that made our humble operation look like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The article came out 3 weeks later with the headline, "Power to the People, How One Family Brought a Historic Mill Back to Life." Seeing our story in print felt surreal. There was my picture next to Grandpa's restored mill wheel, with a caption identifying me as entrepreneur and sustainable energy pioneer Jake Thompson. Frank got the biggest kick out of being described as a master craftsman and Vietnam veteran whose mechanical expertise proved crucial to the restoration. He kept that magazine clipping in his wallet and showed it to everyone at the VFW hall. Anna was quoted extensively about micro-hydroelectric systems and the importance of preserving American industrial heritage. The magazine article opened floodgates we hadn't expected. Suddenly, we were getting calls from other mill owners who wanted advice on restoration projects. Graduate students were contacting us about including our mill in research papers about sustainable rural development. A textbook publisher asked if they could use our story in a chapter about renewable energy. But the call that really knocked my socks off came on a quiet Thursday morning in late September. I was adjusting the Millstone Gap when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end identified herself as a producer from PBS, calling about a documentary series they were developing about American innovation and sustainable living. She'd read the magazine article and watched our social media content, and she thought our story perfectly captured what they were trying to showcase: ordinary Americans finding extraordinary solutions to modern challenges while honoring their heritage. She wanted to know if we'd be interested in being featured in an episode. I nearly dropped the phone. PBS, the same network that brought us Sesame Street and nature documentaries, was calling Lil Olmy about featuring our mill in a national television program. I told her I was just a farmer, not some kind of celebrity, but she laughed and said that was exactly why our story was so compelling. When I hung up that phone, I stood there in the mill listening to the wheel turn and thinking about how far we'd come from that day in the lawyer's office, when Kevin got everything and I got what seemed like nothing. Anna and Frank were going to flip when I told them PBS wanted to make us television stars. For the first time since this whole adventure started, I felt something close to panic mixed in with the pride. We'd gone from restoring an old mill to becoming some kind of poster family for the American dream, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of attention. But as Grandpa used to say, you can't stop the wheel once it starts turning. 3 weeks after that PBS phone call, I found myself back at the Rusty Spur, watching our segment air on the big screen TV that usually showed football games and NASCAR races. The whole bar had turned out for what felt like our town's version of a movie premiere. There I was on national television, standing next to the mill wheel while some smooth-voiced narrator talked about American ingenuity and sustainable innovation. The crowd was eating it up. Every time I appeared on screen, someone would hoot and holler like I'd just scored the winning touchdown. Old Pete Morrison, who'd been skeptical about the whole mill project from day one, was buying rounds for everyone and telling anyone who'd listened that he'd always believed in me. Anna was in the corner live streaming the whole thing, documenting our 15 minutes of fame for posterity. That's when the mood in the bar shifted. The door opened with a bang that cut through all the celebration noise, and in walked Kevin. But this wasn't the confident, suit-wearing Kevin from the lawyer's office. This was a broken version of my stepbrother. Wearing an old denim jacket I remember from high school, shoulders slumped like he was carrying the weight of the world. The bar went quiet except for the TV, where the PBS narrator was explaining how our mill represented the future of rural American energy production. Kevin stood there in the doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, his eyes darting around the room before settling on me. The contrast was brutal. There I was being celebrated as some kind of local hero, while Kevin looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I'd heard rumors around town about Kevin's troubles, but seeing him in person made it real. Word was that his big corporate farming operation was hemorrhaging money, a combination of bad weather, falling commodity prices, And what he'd later tell me were some seriously poor investment decisions had left him drowning in debt that made my old credit problems look like pocket change. Anna leaned over and whispered that Kevin had been trying to reach me for days, but I'd been too busy with mill tours and media interviews to return his calls. Looking at him standing there like a kick dog while our PBS segment played in the background, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. Kevin made his way over to our table, and I could see every eye in the bar following his movement. Small towns love their drama, and this had all the makings of a showdown between the brother who'd inherited everything and the one who'd been left with scraps. But when Kevin opened his mouth, what came out wasn't anger or jealousy. It was desperation. He said maybe he'd been wrong about the mill. Maybe he'd been wrong about a lot of things. The farm was failing. The bank was moving toward foreclosure, and he was looking at losing everything Dad had built. He asked if maybe we could work together, pool our resources, find a way to save what was left of the family legacy. I sat there sipping my beer while Kevin laid out his problems like cards on a table. Part of me wanted to throw his old insults back in his face, remind him how he called the mill junk, and me a dreamer living in the past. But watching him squirm wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined it would be. Mostly, I just felt tired. When I finally responded, I kept my voice level and matter-of-fact. I told Kevin that he called the mill worthless scrap, but now it was feeding our community and powering homes with clean energy. This was my path, the one I'd built from the ruins of what he'd considered garbage. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't about to abandon everything we'd accomplished either. The conversation that followed wasn't pretty, but it was honest. Kevin admitted he'd been influenced by Sandra's constant negativity about the mill and my attachment to what she called old junk. He'd bought into the idea that bigger was always better, that modern industrial farming was the only way to make real money from the land. Meanwhile, our little mill operation was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined possible. We'd hired 2 local guys, Tom Henderson, who'd been laid off in the grain elevator, and Mike Santos, whose construction company had been struggling since the housing market tanked. Both of them were grateful for steady work and fascinated by the combination of old-world craftsmanship and modern engineering. Anna had been pushing us to expand, talking about opening a second mill in the neighboring county, where another old water mill sat abandoned. She joked that we were going to become the McDonald's of heritage flour, with locations across the rural Midwest. The idea wasn't as crazy as it sounded. We had more demand than we could meet, and other communities were reaching out about restoration projects. That's when Kevin surprised me by asking if there might be a place for him in our operation, not as a partner or decision-maker, but as an employee. He said he needed work, needed to learn something besides the industrial farming techniques that were failing him. I looked at this man who'd inherited everything I'd wanted and somehow managed to lose it all. I offered Kevin a job managing our visitor parking and tour groups. It wasn't glamorous work, directing tour buses, collecting admission fees, answering basic questions about the mill operation. I told him it wasn't like the Excel spreadsheets and commodity trading he was used to, but it was honest work that contributed to something meaningful. Kevin accepted faster than I'd expected. Maybe he was desperate enough to take anything, or maybe he genuinely wanted to be part of what we were building. Either way, watching my stepbrother direct tourist traffic in a fluorescent safety vest was one of those moments that made me think about how strange life could be. The really emotional moment came when Frank showed up at the mill one afternoon carrying an old leather suitcase I'd never seen before. He said he'd been going through some of his things and found something that belonged to me, letters Grandpa had written to him over the years, talking about his dreams for the mill and his hopes for my future. We sat in the mill's office, which was really just a cleaned-up corner of the building with a desk and some filing cabinets, while Frank pulled out envelope after envelope. Grandpa's handwriting covered page after page of hopes and plans that went far beyond our little mill on Blue Creek. One letter from 1995 talked about Grandpa's vision of a mill ring across America, restored water mills creating networks of sustainable energy and traditional food production. He'd identified dozens of abandoned mills in states from Virginia to Oregon, each one a potential link in a chain of living history and environmental responsibility. Reading those letters was like getting advice from beyond the grave. Grandpa had seen something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. He'd known that someday I'd need more than just farming to find my purpose in life. The mill wasn't meant to be my consolation prize. It was meant to be my calling. Another letter described Grandpa's philosophy about adversity in terms that hit me right in the gut. He wrote that when life knocked you down, you had to treat it like grain coming into the mill, break it down, process it, and turn it into something that could nourish people. That was exactly what we'd done with Kevin's inheritance and my apparent misfortune. Frank watched me read through the letters with tears in my eyes, and that knowing smile he got when he was remembering better times. He said Grandpa had talked about me constantly in his final years, always believing that I'd find a way to make the mill work even though everyone else thought it was impossible. The last letter in the stack was dated just 2 months before Grandpa passed away. His handwriting was shakier, but his message was crystal clear. He wrote that the mill wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He'd given me the foundation, but it was up to me to build something bigger, something that could inspire other people to value their heritage while embracing innovation. Sitting there in that mill office, surrounded by the sounds of flowing water and turning stones, reading word my grandfather had written specifically for me to find someday, I felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't just about restoring one old building, or even building a successful business. This was about preserving something essential about American ingenuity and community values. I looked up from the letter to see Anna and Frank watching me with expressions that suggested they understood the weight of what I was holding. Even Kevin, who was visible through the window directing a tour group toward the mill wheel, seemed to sense that something significant was happening. That letter made me realize that everything we'd accomplished so far, the restoration, the business success, the media attention, even the reconciliation with Kevin, was just a foundation for something much larger. Grandpa had seen it coming decades ago, and now it was my responsibility to make his vision real. 3 years later, I was standing on the porch of our new house in the hills overlooking Blue Creek, holding my morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint the valley gold. Down below, the original mill wheel was turning steadily, just like it had every day since we brought it back to life. But now it wasn't alone. Green Heritage Mills had grown into something I never could have imagined back when I was sitting in that lawyer's office feeling sorry for myself. We had 3 mills operating in different states now, each one a restored piece of American industrial heritage generating clean energy and producing heritage flour. Our annual revenue had hit $500,000, and we were employing 23 people across all our locations. Anna loved to joke that we weren't just grinding flour anymore. We were grinding up history and serving it fresh to a country that had forgotten what real craftsmanship looked like. Anna and I had become partners in every sense of the word, though we'd never bothered with the paperwork. She was the business brain, the engineer, the marketing genius who somehow made century-old technology seem cutting edge. I was a hands-on guy, the storyteller, the face that people saw when they thought about what we were building. I liked to tell people she was my wheel, and I was her millstone. We only worked when we moved together. The success had brought changes I'd never expected. I was speaking at renewable energy conferences, consulting with other mill restoration projects, and somehow I'd become what business magazines called a thought leader in sustainable rural development. Me, a guy who'd barely graduated high school and whose biggest accomplishment used to be growing decent corn on marginal farmland. Kevin's transformation had been even more dramatic than mine. He'd started as our parking attendant and tour guide, but his business background and natural charm had made him invaluable. He was now our operations manager, coordinating between all 3 mill locations and handling the logistics that kept our growing enterprise running smoothly. The real vindication came when PBS did a follow-up segment on our expansion. There was Kevin, standing in front of the original mill, talking about how he'd lost everything because he couldn't see the value in old things. He told the interviewer that I'd taught him the difference between what was worthless and what was just waiting for the right person to unlock its potential. Watching my stepbrother give that interview, I realized we both learned something important about family forgiveness and second chances. Kevin would never admit it directly, but working at the mills had given him something his corporate farming operation never could, a sense of purpose that went beyond just making money. Our story had become a case study in business schools and environmental programs across the country. Groups of students would visit our mills to see how traditional technology could address modern challenges. I'd gotten used to standing in front of classrooms full of bright young faces, explaining how sometimes the best path forward involved looking backward. The original Blue Creek Mill had become a registered National Historic Landmark, and we had installed a bronze plaque by the main entrance that read, "What others saw as junk became my salvation." Those words summed up everything about our journey. How the thing that seemed like a consolation prize had turned into the foundation for something bigger than any of us had dreamed. Frank had lived to see all 3 mills in operation before his health finally declined beyond what stubborn determination could overcome. He'd spent his final months training younger craftsmen in the traditional millwright techniques that were in danger of being lost forever. His funeral had been attended by people from all over the country whose lives had been touched by his knowledge and generosity. The ripple effects of our success kept spreading in ways that surprised me. Other communities started reaching out about their own abandoned mills, wanting to know how they could follow our model. We'd help with restorations in Vermont, North Carolina, and Oregon, creating a network of working mills that Anna called America's Mill Ring. Local schools had started bringing students to our mills as part of their science and history curricula. Watching kids' faces light up when they saw grain being ground by water power and electricity being generated without burning fossil fuels reminded me why this work mattered. We were showing them that innovation didn't always mean starting from scratch. Sometimes it meant rediscovering wisdom that previous generations had figured out. The financial success had been gratifying, but the real reward was seeing how our work had inspired other people to look at their own communities differently. Abandoned buildings that might have been torn down were being restored. Traditional crafts that were dying out were finding new practitioners. Small towns were discovering that their history could be their economic future. Anna had started writing a book about our experience, tentatively titled Turning the Wheel: How Traditional Technology Can Power Modern Solutions. Publishers were interested, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences about sustainable development and rural entrepreneurship. She still insisted she was just an engineer who got lucky, but watching her command a room full of experts, I knew she was selling herself short. The personal rewards had been just as meaningful as the professional ones. I'd gone from being a forgotten son who inherited the scraps to being someone who'd built something lasting and important. More than that, I'd found my purpose, not just running mills, but preserving a way of life that connected people to their food, their history, and their environment. That sense of purpose had become my personal philosophy about how life worked. I'd started telling people that life was like a mill. If you didn't keep the wheel turning, you wouldn't get any light or bread. Simple wisdom, maybe, but it captured something essential about the need to stay active, stay engaged, and keep pushing forward even when things seemed impossible. The latest development in our mill ring had come from an unexpected source. A few weeks earlier, I'd received a letter from someone claiming to be the great-grandson of the original builder of a mill about 50 miles north of Blue Creek. He'd heard about our work and wanted to know if we'd be interested in taking on another restoration project. The letter included photographs of a mill that was even older than ours, built in the 1890s but abandoned since the 1960s. The building was in rough shape, but the basic structure looked solid, and there was still plenty of water flow from the creek that powered it. The writer said his family had been trying to figure out what to do with the property for decades. What really caught my attention was the personal note he'd included. He wrote that his great-grandfather had been inspired by the mill builders who came before him, and he hoped we'd be inspired to continue that tradition. He said the mill was waiting for someone who understood that old things could have new life when they found the right hands to restore them. Reading that letter on my porch that morning, watching the sun come up over our valley and listening to the familiar sound of water turning wheels, I felt the same spark I'd experienced that day in the trailer when I first found Grandpa's blueprints. Here was another chance to bring something meaningful back to life, another opportunity to honor the past while building the future. The letter had included something else, an old brass key that the writer said had belonged to the original mill. He'd attached a note saying the mill was waiting for my wheel to bring it back to life. Holding that key, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice telling me that the work wasn't finished, that there were still more wheels waiting to turn. Anna found me on the porch later that morning, still holding the letter and the key, still thinking about the next chapter in our story. She took one look at my face and started laughing, saying she recognized that expression from 3 years ago when I first decided to restore the Blue Creek Mill. She was right. I was already planning the next restoration, already imagining another abandoned mill coming back to life. Standing there with Anna, looking down at the mill that had started everything, I realized that Grandpa had been right about more than just the potential of flowing water. He'd understood that some people are meant to be builders, meant to take broken things and make them work again, meant to turn forgotten history into living heritage. I smiled and whispered something to the morning air that probably sounded foolish to anyone who might have overheard. I told Grandpa he was still with me, still guiding me toward the next wheel that needed turning. The mill ring was growing, and somewhere out there, another piece of American ingenuity was waiting for someone to believe in its potential again.